Hey mom, can we get some Astral chain? No honey, we have Astral chain at home.
Astral chain at home.
Ah, yes. Man, that joke was so good. I just had to use it in the title as well. It's also because I have no imagination, but hey, you know who does have imagination? The creative thing behind Scarlet Nexus has some imagination. Because, jokes aside, Scarlet Nexus is actually a surprisingly great game with a lot of differences, compared to Astral Chain I mean, but before we talk about those, let's list the similarities instead. Both games have you working as a special government official with superpowers trying to fight against an enemy that's invading from technically another world. Both games require you to choose between a male or a female protagonist at the start, they both take place in a cyberpunk future, and in both cases you get to chill around in your hideout in between main story chapters. Wow, there's actually a lot of similarities when you think about it, but the most essential part of a video game, the gameplay, is actually completely different. While Astral Chain tried to be a little bit more experimental by giving you control of two fighters at the same time, Scarlet Nexus is a lot more traditional by having you take control of a single character that can pull off different powers from other characters, and having more of a focus on environmental elements tied to the main character's abilities of telekinesis. If that was a mouthful of information, then let's slow down and allow me to elaborate on that. When you first start Scarlet Nexus, you must choose between two different characters, Yuito Sumeragi and Kasane Randall. Both characters have their own individual stories, but their special power is identical, that power being telekinesis, which you can use to throw around environmental objects at enemies. You don't get to pick and choose the exact object, but they pretty much behave exactly the same and act essentially as your projectile attack, which is fueled by an energy bar style system. The normal attacks though do differ between characters, with Yuito being more of an up-close melee fighter using a sword, and Kasane being more of a ranged fighter with a special attack that causes damage while simultaneously moving her out of harm's way. But hidden within the combat system is a detail that turns it into a pretty addictive gameplay loop. The thing is, if you use your telekinesis right after landing an attack, you will charge up the object and it will cause more damage when it hits. And if you attack right after you land an object using telekinesis, you will dash close to the enemy and immediately land a hit for massive damage. So switching between telekinesis and normal attacks is the key to maximizing damage, with the special attack also having the advantage of greatly recharging your telekinesis bar if it gets too low. I used every attack available consistently, and once I got into the flow of things, the combat felt pretty damn great. Of course, massive damage isn't the only advantage of switching things up, as switching them up also causes greater damage to the enemy's break bar, which if you have been following games recently, you have a pretty good idea of what it does. Except in this case, it doesn't temporarily stun enemy when you drain it or when you charge it. Oh no, draining an enemy's break bar allows you to perform a brain crush, which, with the exception of boss battles, just straight up kills the enemy in a very cool animation, which is undeniably neato. And on the side of telekinesis, you also get special objects in each combat arena that work differently from the usual ones. You use a different button as well to, well, use them. And each of them works differently. Sometimes they split into two when they hit the enemy, allowing you to use a QTE to crush the enemy between the two halves. Sometimes they just explode. Sometimes you get to surf on them. It's up to you to figure out what each one does and when it's the best time to use them, given that they are in extremely limited supply compared to the normal objects. My favorite ones got to be the ones that have QTEs attached to them, which is honestly almost all of them, but they're pretty neat. You usually have to move the stick or mash buttons in a way that makes sense considering what the character is trying to accomplish, and your controller vibrates with each hit, giving a true sense of kinesthetic fun as you bash enemies in the head. It overall just feels pretty great. And then, of course, you get the usual hack and slash super modes. Yes, I said modes because Scarlet Nexus is just too cool to have one super mode. Instead you get two. You get Brain Drive, a mode that activates automatically, which causes you to hit harder and multiplies the EXP you get, because of course you have levels and of course you have a skill tree and equipment as well, because why not? This is just one step away from being a JRPG anyway. And then there is its much cooler cousin, Brain Field, which teleports your characters and the enemies into the Brain Zone, where you get to slap them around for a certain period of time. It's much cooler than I make it sound, please trust me. It also comes with a very nice quirk of you dying if you fail to deactivate it before time is up, because you gotta sell that using your super power is dangerous after all. That barely scratches the surface of the mechanics though, because after all of that we still have to talk about SAS, a system which allows you to temporarily borrow the superpowers of your fellow squad of psychic soldiers. You can, for example, borrow pyrokinesis in order to set your weapon on fire, which is doubly useful when you combine it with the status effect systems to cover your enemies in oil and then set them on fire. But even so, that's just a basic elemental buff. How about becoming fucking invincible to all damage and just hearing those satisfying damage failure sounds for a limited time, of course. Or even better, teleporting and slowing down time to catch enemies by surprise and really dish out the pain. The further you get into the game, the crazier the powers get, and it feels pretty damn good once the game finally allows you to play with all of the toys it brought out for you. Especially when you unlock the ability to use multiple powers at once and you can just melt the competition with some crazy combinations. All of this is based around a cooldown system though, so you can't just abuse your powers constantly. You must instead cycle through them. If pyrokinesis is not available, why not try electrokinesis instead? If you can't teleport right now, why not slow down time? Or just throw a car from a distance instead and just forgo SAS entirely. The end game is to pretty much keep cycling through all of the powers, so you always got the advantage on something, which kind of feels like an MMO rotation at times, but given the nature of the crazy amount of enemy variety and all of their different weaknesses, you can't really settle on a single routine. Understanding when a power is simply useless is key to fighting effectively, so you can't just mash your skills out of situations. Or you can. Maybe you can. Honestly, the game is not very hard, but you will hit a wall of boredom in the form of enemies feeling like a series of damage sponges if you don't learn to manage your powers and the environmental tools available to you at any given time, which makes the game pretty damn engaging from a gameplay perspective. Gameplay is not everything though, so how about we talk about the other cool thing you probably noticed right away outside of the game, which is the presentation. Damn! Psycho Coffee, the blend that was made 100% for me. So, Scarlet Nexus has a very unique visual style to it. The man-made structures around you mostly have this muted, faded out look to them, which is a far cry from what you would expect an anime game to look at. You usually expect it to be saturated as hell. And then there's the holograms everywhere around you that pop out, but honestly, not that much compared to the buildings. If anything really pops out in the scenery at all, it's the main character and their gang, which do look unabashedly anime, but even they are dressed in mostly red and black, so even in standing out, they don't stand out that much. I do appreciate their character design though. They do wear all sorts of different clothes, even though military do be all about them uniforms, but in unifying their color palette, the designers make them feel like they belong to the world, and more importantly, to a specific organization in the setting. And that goes a long way towards making the player feel immersed in the setting of the story, while still keeping the cool character factor all around them. And it is a pretty interesting setting to get immersed into. The creators called it the first brainpunk game ever made, but honestly, if they hadn't said that, I never would have figured out that is why the characters talk so much about brain and why so much emphasis is placed on them throughout the story. Even after all of that though, this is pretty much just a cyberpunk story, though told through the lens of what is essentially an alien invasion of sorts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's try to make a quick summary of the plot first. Scarlet Nexus takes place in a future where humanity lives in constant fear of the Others, which are a race of creatures that drop from a weird cloud of particles in outer space called the Extinction Belt. And the Others' main source of food is, you guessed it, brains. So they are kind of like fancy smanshy zombies when you think about it. The protagonists, Yuito and Kasane, are cadets that join the OSF, a sort of military institution that uses psychic superpowers specifically in order to fight back against the threat of the Others, given that normal ammunition just doesn't work against them. Each one follows an individual path with their own specific plot beats, but both eventually have to deal with the differences between the factions that inhabit their world and the conspiracies surrounding some very awful truths about the Others. This game surprisingly deals with some really awful shit. You even get to see the holographically censored headless bodies of some unlucky soldiers who got their brains munched on during the very prologue of the game, which came as a bit of a surprise to me. It never gets visually graphic, and beyond the initial shock of some plot twists, it never really bothered me too much, but if discussions of topics like these make you queasy, you should probably think twice before delving into this one. This is very much a serious attempt of writing a cyberpunk story, with all that entails from the genre. This does work in the game's favor though. While the story is slow to start, more on that later, once it does, it becomes the game version of a page-turner. Each chapter ending in bigger and bigger twists and with stakes that actually mean something as characters begin to die. You just can't help but wonder just what everything is building up to. In between all of those intense plot twists though, you need a place to chill, and that's your hideout. A place to hang out with the gang and to give them gifts to raise your bond so you can SAS their respective powers a little bit better. And also watch/play some Bond episodes where you get to watch them develop and get closer to them as you understand them better. Some Bond episodes are playable, but most of them are just visual novel segments that you watch through the game's patented, stylish, thick-ass borders, which are technically not borders so much as endless voids of red strings with a static shot of the action floating through them. It gives a sort of cheap vibe sometimes, but I do like my thick-ass borders, and they also do some really cool stuff with them, like having the frame itself get thrown back when a character is thrown back, and they also seamlessly flow into proper budget cutscene mode when necessary, so I do enjoy them. But then you also very rarely get just the cheapest interaction possible with some classic text boxes, so I don't really know what to make of them. Should we call them mid-budget cutscenes instead of low-budget? You decide. So, with all that I've described so far, you're probably thinking, wow, this game does sound really great, how come I haven't heard much about it? I do have to admit that this game has some flaws, like its incredibly poor attempt at air juggling mechanics, but I personally think it has a lot more to do with pacing. While I don't believe that anyone who spent $60 in it during release was going to just drop it during the start, I also don't think anyone watching the first few hours of gameplay is going to be enticed to purchase or discuss it. It simply starts off too slow before things kick into full gear. I'd argue the plot really starts during the end of chapter 2, and you can reach that from anywhere between 2 to 4 hours depending on how much exploring you like to do, and even then, it takes even more time before all of the gameplay elements are introduced and you get a full set of SAS abilities to play around with. While I'd argue that at this point you already have all that you need to have plenty of fun, unfortunately you don't even get to unlock the full potential of SAS until you have all party members at your side, and given the split of the stories between Yuito and Kasane, who both have different party members follow them at different times, you only get to see the true, full potential of the gameplay about 85% through the story. At that point, I was already having a ton of fun with the game, but it's frustrating reaching it only to be told that I had barely any game left to enjoy it with all of the abilities unlocked, unless I wanted to grind in previous areas. Something that is already egregious considering the game already recycles areas during the main story in order to pad out game time. There's also the fact that while the story ties the more personal threads very neatly in the end, it still feels unsatisfying since all of the heavy stuff I mentioned before don't really carry the weight and consequence they should. People will literally try to kill each other in one chapter and then immediately hang out during Bond episodes like nothing happened. And this all culminates in an ending that will keep you scratching your head thinking about all of the conspiracies and just how they were resolved, assuming they even were in the first place. I'm not saying the writers should have gone full grimdark with the story, especially since it wouldn't necessarily fit into this specific tale, and that it runs the risk of making it feel like just another depressing cyberpunk in a sea of depressing cyberpunk, but injecting just a little bit more cynicism into its characters would go a long way toward making this finale a more satisfying conclusion. Considering how deep into the game this is, I don't think this was a factor in why people didn't talk so much about it compared to, say, Tales of Arise, which is apparently a runaway hit, but it's something to keep in mind anyway if you're planning on playing the game. In conclusion, Scarlet Nexus is a great game, one of my favorite surprises of 2021, no doubt about it. It has fantastic gameplay, a stylish look, an anime opening that I love, and a suit that plays the opening when you activate Brainfield, but only if you pre-order the game. Thanks Bandai, I hate it. But unfortunately, a few bad decisions end up dragging the entire game down. I feel like they really needed to rethink the whole Yuito and Kasane route split. I will admit that I only played through Yuito to conclusion. It took me about 19 hours, and then I played a couple more hours as Kasane on New Game Plus, so I didn't see everything the game has to offer, but from what I've seen of the game, a more traditional campaign with only a single protagonist where you unlock 4 SAS buddies right off the bat, and then you get to unlock more as you go along, and you had a full party about halfway through, might have worked better. As it stands, Scarlet Nexus can feel a bit stretched thin in trying to realize its epic sci-fi double story ambitions, but it's still a pretty great game, and it is on Game Pass if you have that and you just want to try it out. So if you got the patience to get through the first couple hours, I guarantee you'll find a pretty juicy action RPG to bite into.